Hi everyone, Joe Kral, President of the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to this week's edition of Pro-Life University. Last week, as you already know, we covered the subject of the various states that were placing orders by the various governors prohibiting the practice of abortion because abortion was being seen as non-essential. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more of what's going on, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the gospel of life, in particular, John Paul II's principle of incrementalism. Last week, we didn't get to talk about that, and to some extent, it's sad because of what's going on with the coronavirus. However, I think this week is a good way to, make up for it and explain how these temporary orders kind of fit into this idea of the principle of incrementalism. And, I really wanted to talk about the principle of incrementalism and John Paul II's encyclical, The Gospel of Life, last week because it was obviously the 25th anniversary for that encyclical. But I think a lot of the stuff that was going on with the crisis regarding COVID-19, since we were dealing with that, I think it was also important to talk about those particular issues. But let's just sort of jump in today, if we can. One of the things, again, like I said just a moment ago, last week we saw a lot of states whose governors declared that abortion were non-essential services. And so they ordered abortion clinics to shut. Now, obviously, to some extent, we saw that happen in some states, for example. Texas was the predominant state because just a few days afterwards, a suit was filed to challenge that particular order. And they had a hearing on Monday where a federal judge, a federal district judge, basically said that the order was temporarily restrained from going into effect. Then Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton immediately sought relief from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They agreed with Attorney General Paxton and basically said during the time frame of the trial regarding the order could take effect. So abortion clinics have to be closed during this particular time in Texas. And we're seeing this in various states as well where they've filed suit. We've certainly seen it in Iowa, Ohio, various other places as well. Now, let me just sort of jump in here. There's no mystery that I am very much in favor of pro-life incrementalism, when it comes to legislation and so forth. And some of the questions that, I've been asking myself and some other folks have been asking me throughout this past week or so, is how does it fit into this? Is this really sort of an incremental measure? And I think that's a great question and something that ought to be explored and certainly looked into a little bit more deeply. So let's just do that. We don't have to sit there and go for hours and hours about it. We can just spend a few minutes here and talking about it. In my personal opinion, as someone who's been in the pro-life movement now going on 23 years, I can certainly say this. I think in many ways what we see around the country is sort of if you will, kind of a short-sighted view, if you will, kind of a microcosm, if you will, of what is likely to happen when Roe v. Wade is finally overturned, in whatever capacity that is, whether it's a Supreme Court that overturns it or a human life amendment is ratified into the U.S. Constitution. Whatever way, I think in many ways we see something that's going on. So what do I mean by this? Well, basically, I think the important thing to take note here is the states that are very active in passing pro-life laws. We certainly see a deep respect for the unborn and for humanity in general. So, we could look at the orders of, say, Texas or Louisiana. All right, there is actually several states out there whose orders are virtually identical. Now, what we see here is a case in which, incrementalism has obviously led to a particular point, right? Where here we see the suspension of the practice of abortion, right? That's something to note there, that ultimately the culture has moved forward, and this culture, since it's been moving forward, has been electing officials who also hold the value of human life dear to their hearts. And so, as a result, we see a culture speaking out against the atrocity of abortion on a grand scale. All right. Now, let's be clear here. All right. Let me just simply say this. One of the important points I say is a proper respect for humanity as a whole. And I think that's important here because we need to understand, and I certainly take the position from at least a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint, that abortions need to be shut down during this time. In addition to, obviously, the killing of the unborn child, which is a completely unjust action, we also need to consider, the doctors that are treating these patients that have coronavirus and their need to have the proper medical equipment, all right, PPEs, for example. So when a state, say like New York, which hasn't really passed many pro-life laws, if any at all right, where they allow, they say all non-essential surgeries are not to take place, except for abortion. Right. So when you see that exception in place, for example, we don't necessarily, in my ethical opinion, as someone who looks at public policy, we haven't developed a proper respect for a culture of life. We don't see these folks that are being elected to high office that embody that sort of culture. And as a respect, there seems to be a little bit of a disregard for all of human life, that somehow, abortion is somehow exempted from this. And as a result, it puts other people's lives at risk, literally. If they can't use the proper equipment to clothe themselves in and to protect themselves in, these doctors and nurses and so forth, what does that really say about their respect for human life and so forth? Right? So that's one of the major points that I really want to bring up there, because I think that's vitally important to understand. So in many ways, it kind of gives us, a view of where we're going as a state, or where we have been as a state when it comes to pro-life legislation. I think it has shown us, that are we going in the right direction to institute a culture of life? Is there a lot more to do to help institute a culture of life? I think it gives us those signs, if you will. Now, let me be clear here, and I think, I certainly hope that people understand this, that these are temporary orders. That means that once this pandemic passes, the order is going to be dropped, and everything's going to go back to the way it was, meaning that abortions will be practiced. But I think, and really, I really see this strong viewpoint when it comes to this idea of incrementalism here, that even when this happens, all right, we've got to understand a few things, that this little order, if you will, and it's not really little, I mean, let's be honest, this is a big thing, but this order has had an effect on society, especially in these states that have basically said no abortions are going to happen during this pandemic. We need that equipment to help other human life. That sends a strong message that all human life is sacred, right? Not just the unborn, but we need to protect, the doctors and the nurses, give them the proper materials to do what they need to do to practice so they don't get sick, so they can help heal the sick. That is a strong, strong message, right? So I think that's one good thing that comes out of this, right? That people begin to learn that, all life ought to be respected. Two, I think in these states where abortion has been deemed non-essential, that really sends another strong message to the populace as a whole as well, that abortion is just that. It's non-essential. It's a purely elective surgery that's done, and as a result, it shouldn't have any sort of special status. And I think that sends another message to these people, that abortion is not nearly as important to the everyday life as many pro-abortion organizations would like folks to think. Thirdly, and I think this is important too, we know that during this time, many of these women who are pregnant we'll be looking into alternatives, life-affirming alternatives of what to do with respect to their pregnancy. So many of these ladies may be keeping their children or giving their children up for adoption, but that's important as well. During this time, it also shows the community, that state's community, the need for life-affirming options as well. So hopefully this will lead to further pro-life legislation down the road, so when Roe v. Wade is eventually overturned, these states have the opportunity at that point in time to truly ban abortion. And it's certainly something that the culture, the whole state community, if you will, is willing to accept. I think in many ways, now kind of jumping to the Gospel of Life, because the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae, which was released on March 25th, 1995 by Pope John Paul II, really, in many ways, was genius. He really kind of lays out the principle of incrementalism, which has really become the backbone of the legislative push of the pro-life movement, moving us towards a culture of life, if you will. And I think in many ways, the genius of Pope John Paul II is certainly seen with these orders. I think in many respects, if a state had not been passing pro-life legislation, if no state had been passing pro-life legislation, again, abortion would have been the exception in virtually all the states, I'd be willing to bet. And that just seems sort of natural because law, in many ways, is kind of, it helps influence a cultural, and it helps influence the culture, helps influence behavior, and it helps influence the way people think. So if people are thinking that abortion is just fine, you're probably going to have elected officials that think that as well. If you have a culture that's really strong and pro-life, you're going to be electing officials that obviously reflect that value as well. And so in many ways, I kind of think that we're kind of seeing, if you will, what is probably going to happen. What is the status of each state when it comes to passing pro-life legislation? So for example, some states might need to work a little bit more. They got something pushed there, right? They declared abortion as non-essential, but they're not really doing anything to stop it. Well, it's good that they declared abortion non-essential. It's bad that they're not stopping it. But it shows that some work probably needs to be done in that state to push for more pro-life legislation. And so I think in many respects, when we talk about the gospel of life, we can even apply it to this very thing here. And I think in many ways, miracles work in strange ways. And in this time of crisis, I mean, we can even see the genius, not just the genius of John Paul II, but literally the genius of God working through about where we as a movement are, even in our own individual states. What do we need to do? What do we need to do more of, and so forth? Are we having a good impact? Can we really make it over the finish line, so to speak? And so I think that these are all important things to consider. Again, like I said, unfortunately, this pandemic will end, and what I mean unfortunately here is that, these orders are going to be dropped and things are going to get back to the way they were. And that is going to show the pro-life movement as a whole, or at least state by state, where they're going to be and what they need to do and how they need to push a little bit further, pushing towards a good culture of life. All right. Again, folks, I appreciate y'all watching this. I enjoy doing these every week. Give us a big thumbs up. Always appreciate it. And guys, be sure to subscribe to our channel. And I hope you have a safe weekend. Stay healthy. Please, again, observe social distancing. It's really our obligation as human beings to practice, good, healthy safety measures in this time. So please do that. God bless, and stay safe, folks. Bye-bye.